Hello, welcome to yesterday's airlines. Hot on the heels of the JC Wings announcements, we have the Gemini Jets November announcements. And NG Models have also just announced as well, so there'll probably be a video for that one coming soon. But today we're focusing on Gemini's November releases. We've got 11 models to talk about. And before I do that, let's have a quick look over last month's models. It doesn't look like there were any horrific mistakes or problems. The models turned out pretty much as you'd expect. So the pretty ordinary stuff like the America West Retro A321 and the Delta A330, they turned out fine, but not spectacular. And some of the models turned out much better, like the Delta Connection SkyWest CRJ, which looks like it avoided any problems with the landing gear and turned out very nicely from the pictures I've seen. There's also, the standard Neos, which always look pretty mediocre, a perfectly respectable JetBlue E-Jet. That very colourful Emirates A380, which turned out to be in the NBA scheme. I actually don't dislike the livery. It looks not bad, and actually even the model here looks pretty good, and I've seen some other pictures of it, and yeah, it looks okay. Within the limits of the Gemini A380 mould, obviously, but it's fine. So it was a perfectly respectable month from GJ last month, and this month we've got, I almost say it every month to be honest, a very Gemini set of models, the usual suspects, not a lot of surprises. But clearly they sell, and so a good chunk of collectors are happy with this kind of, well, I was going to say regurgitation of the same airlines and aircraft most months, but there is some good stuff within. So before I get on to check these models out, don't forget to chuck a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. Always loads of content on here because releases are endless in 400 scale, and it looks like that is going to continue well into 2025, and even more new brands are likely to join the marketplace. Also, don't forget to check me out on Instagram at Yester Airlines and on Facebook and yesterdaysairlines.com, where I post a lot of written content, looking at molds, checking out individual model reviews, that kind of thing. Okay, but let's get on and check out these Gemini releases for November. Okay, so we're going to start with the Airbus and Boeings, and I have to say this is the least interesting part of the release set by some distance, mainly because it is incredibly familiar and not necessarily using the best molds that Gemini have access to. So we start with an American Airlines A321neo. The reg is N413 Alpha November. Very familiar because they released a American Airlines A321neo last year in July. That one was N421 Uniform Whiskey, and they also released one in January 2019 as well, so that was a lot older, but still, this is the third A321neo released by Gemini. Interestingly, there have been no A321neos released by NG, so there's no competition in this space presently, so you're stuck with these ones unless you want to try and find the old Era Classics release from 2019, which frankly probably isn't much better than these ones. Looking at the pictures of last year's release, and it looks, like it always does when you look at this mould. The nose is slightly misshapen, the undercarriage is a little chunky, the engine's enormous. And overall, it's not a great look. The aerials are a bit big, things aren't fitted particularly well. It's not the finest work. So, it's a re-release. It's not looking particularly good. I don't think it will look especially great. I'm going to put this one into gas guzzler. Next up, we've got another A321neo. This one's for a newly delivered aircraft. It's KLM, so this is not a big surprise. KLM is an airline that Gemini released quite a bit. PHAXA Swallowtail, the first A321neo for the Dutch flag carrier. And Gemini are third to release this because Phoenix released it quite a long time ago now, back in July, at least that's when it was announced, and Era Classics have literally just released it on Friday. So Gemini are the third company to make this. It's disappointing in a sense that if you look at all three of these releases, they're all not particularly great. The Phoenix A321, pretty mediocre really across the board. Aero Classics has got some really dodgy undercarriage going on, generally makes the colours for KLM too dark and doesn't add aerials or other print detailing. And Gemini, of course, got this donkey of a mould. So overall, you've got 3 options here. None of them are good. And if I were you, I'd just be waiting around until it got produced by NG. Now, they haven't announced it yet, but I'd be surprised if they didn't at some point. It's kind of a shame that in 2024 we still have so many ordinary A321 moulds floating around, and the best ones are the Panda models mould and the NG models mould, but the Panda mould doesn't get used that much because Panda just don't release that many models. So it's disappointing that the best ones generally don't get used that much, and instead we get quite a lot of relatively ordinary A321s. And I'm going to put this one again in the gas guzzler. I don't expect it to be great. Third model of the month is a Delta Airlines A350. Couldn't get much more Gemini than a Delta A350, and indeed Gemini have made 6 previous Delta A350s, although 2 of those have been in special colours released this year. Before that, they had released a version in 2021 that was flaps up and down, and they had released versions in 2017 and 2018. I don't expect, to be honest, this one to be very different to those. It will look broadly the same. But it has been a few years since they produced one, I guess, and ultimately Delta A350s are reasonably popular. Of course, that's not to say that there aren't other brands that have released Delta A350s as well. Now, there's been a lot of these Team USA and LA 28 versions recently, but there have been versions by Aviation 400, there have been versions by NG models, all made within the last 3 or 4 years. So it's not like there aren't versions around that are alternatives to what is probably a pretty ordinary A350 that this will turn out to be. But this one's obviously available now and is going to be probably easy to find. It's really just crying workhorse for me, this one. Another aircraft that has been appearing a lot in 400 scale releases is this last 747 N863 Golf Tango. And there have been 9 releases of this aircraft in 400 scale, though a lot of them have been in the primer colours and not wearing the Atlas Air Apex Logistics scheme. However, some of them have been wearing the Atlas Air Apex Logistics scheme, and we've had versions released by NG models that do wear that livery. We now have a version from Gemini. This one is going to be on the interactive mould, so that does add some detail and interest here if you like the interactive mould, though I know lots of people don't. Gemini did make an A63 GT as well back in December, and that one didn't use the interactive mould, so you got different versions of this floating about the place. It doesn't. I've struggled to get excited by it, to be honest. It's just not that interesting. There have been these 2 previous versions from Gemini and NG on the non-interactive mould. I do like the interactive, but this one's not really doing much for me. I'm going to workhorse this one as well. Now, one of Gemini's big airline customers is Federal Express, and FedEx have just modified their livery a few months ago. I hadn't even realised, and to be honest, the modifications are not massive. Basically, if you look at the images that FedEx themselves have provided, the big changes are that they have removed the Express from underneath FedEx, and they have made the engines all white, and they've slightly increased the size of the FedEx logo. So it's simpler, it's kind of cleaner. FedEx Express never really made any sense. And that new livery looks pretty good. Interestingly, this artwork from Gemini doesn't show that new scheme. It kind of shows a halfway house livery where you've got the Express removed from the fuselage, but you haven't got it removed from the engines. And the engines still say FedEx Express on this aircraft, N895FD. And I don't know if that will be altered before the aircraft model is made, or whether that is the intention that it will look like this. Looking around at the actual aircraft, it does seem that it is currently painted in this version with the titles on the engine, but it doesn't match up with the artwork which Federal Express themselves provided in August of aircraft without anything on the engine. So that's weird. I don't know what's going on, whether FedEx has changed its mind and is going to keep the FedEx Express on the engines, or whether this aircraft just hasn't had the engines updated yet, or what. But just to be aware that this may not be the final version, because if you look at the FedEx publicity, then it's different. With the FedEx Express on the engines, it really makes it even less exciting. Having the engines all white on the artwork FedEx provided actually makes the aircraft look better, I think. Yeah. What can I say? This isn't exciting. It may be a slightly updated scheme, but the version that's being produced here is barely different to the standard version. Obviously, Gemini have made plenty of FedEx 777s in the past. I think that I'll put this one just as a workhorse as well. If it was missing the FedEx Express on the engines, maybe it would get to be high fly, I'm not sure. Yeah. Interestingly, also, the artwork shows the blue looking like way too light. But I presume they'll fix that. They've made this model hundreds of times before. So that's the Airbus and the Boeing contingent of the civil part of the releases here. And yeah, it's not overly exciting, is it? It's very familiar territory. But things do improve now, because we're moving on to some regional types, which are a lot more interesting than what we've been looking at so far. And we begin with a third release for the Norwegian airline Widerøe. And in fact, the second in a couple of months. Last month they announced that Dash 8 Q400 in the new scheme, and this month we've got an Embraer 190 E2. And what is interesting is that this will be the first release of this E190 E2 mould. So this technically is a new mould. I know JC Wings have announced an E190 E2 themselves, but they haven't released it. So it is interesting that this will be the first time we've seen it. Obviously, what we have had this year are a selection of very nice E195 E2s, but we haven't had an E190 E2. So this one, LN Whiskey Echo Alpha, will be, I think, a really good model. I was in Bergen recently and I saw a couple of these. I was really annoyed because originally I was going to be flying one from Liverpool to Bergen, but in the end they cancelled that flight and I ended up having to fly just 737s and A320s basically via Oslo. So I missed out, but I did see them at Bergen when I was there, and yeah, I like the aircraft, like the airline. It's a really good choice. This one's supersonic for me. Obviously it's never been made before, and it's nice to see a new airline get into Gemini's playbook. Next up, we've got another regional aircraft, and this one's back in the States. It's another Dash 8. Now, we've been having a few Dash 8s recently. I just talked about a Series 200 in the JC Wings video. This one is a Series 100. From the outside, they look effectively the same. It is N808EX. It's in the colours of American Eagle. It's flown by Piedmont Airlines, or it was flown by Piedmont, and it's got the new American Eagle scheme, which, to be honest, doesn't really seem to fit on a Dash 8 particularly nicely. I can't say I'm loving it. But this aircraft was transferred from US Airways Express in 2015 and flew for a couple of years in this American Eagle scheme before being retired in 2017. And in fact, Piedmont nowadays is entirely flying E-Jets and has retired over 100 Dash 8. So this one's quite a nice callback, I think, to, well, you know, what was originally Henson Airlines, and it was a big Dash 8 operator. So it's a nice historical airline, even from only probably seven years or so ago. But super nice to get it, even though I don't think the livery is particularly good on the Dash 8 here. So, like it. Always good to see more Dash 8s. Love the little mould here, and I think this one will do nicely. So this one's going to be supersonic again. And our last regional aircraft for the month is another Dash 8, but this one is a Q400. And again, I think this one again will be popular. It's operated by WestJet Encore, and it is CFO Echo November, and it is wearing the newer version of this livery that WestJet are operating. There has been a WestJet Dash 8 made previously. It was made a long time ago, though, back in 2014. And that was wearing the old scheme, obviously. This one, wearing the new scheme, it's going to look really nice. Like the mould. I've talked about this again, just in the last JC Wings video with that Japanese Q400 that they're making. So everything I said about that will fit this one too, hopefully. It should be really good. And I think there's going to be strong demand for it. And once again, I think I'll supersonic this one as well. So in terms of these regional releases, I think Gemini is very strong. And I think they're good choices. They're not models that fit my collection criteria, but I can see the value of them and they're going to look nice. Now, we've also got a couple of Gemini Max releases this month. First up is a Royal Australian Air Force 737 MAX 8. And this aircraft is registered A62002. Now, what is a little bit interesting is that I've literally just seen the latest NG list, and NG have also announced this aircraft as well as its sister ship A62001. So there is some serious competition here for this model from NG, and they're both releasing effectively at the same time. So this one's really giving you the choice of which one you prefer. For me, they'll both be good releases. Don't have any big problems with the Gemini Max 8 mold. It's probably not quite as good as the NG one, but should be a solid release anyway, and don't have any major issues with it. I think I'll put this one up into high flyer. Okay, and that leaves one last military release. This one's another C-17 Globemaster 3. Yeah, there's not a huge amount to say about this one, really. It's in the colours of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which obviously just means you get a little bit of a Wright-Patterson flash on the tail. They've made a lot of, well over 45 C-17s, most of them US Air Force. They all look broadly the same except for that tail flash. They announced one just in September. They've got another one here in November. So they generally announce 2 or 3 a year. They all look broadly the same. But I guess if you're a US Air Force collector, then that doesn't necessarily bother you too much. Yeah, there's not much to say. It's going to be fine. I'll put this one into Workhorse. And the last model of the month, just to touch upon, is of course one which is not part of the November announcements. It was announced a couple of weeks ago, just before the US election. And this is the Harris Wolf's jet. So following up from their release of the Trump jet in, I think that was October. A few weeks later, they've announced this one. Yeah. What can I say about this to please my listeners? Well, the timing is interesting. I mean, if you believe Gemini's mouthpiece, who does watch these videos, hello Gemini's mouthpiece, then this illustrates Gemini's, level-headed magnanimity and lack of bias. But I would argue equally that they released it well after the Trump version, so it kind of illustrates where Gemini's leanings are. Hey, that's fine. They can vote for who they like, but don't pretend. And I think it does illustrate that Gemini like to make money, and therefore are happy to play both sides against the middle. But what do I think of the actual model itself? Yeah, it's not going to be particularly good, is it? Having said that, the Trump one looked better than I thought it would. The mould looked better. It helps if you put things together properly. But the livery here is rubbish. It's worse than the Trump livery, to be honest. So it's not doing much for me. Yeah, I think I'll just put this one in the gas guzzler. I know I scrap metaled the Trump one, but then I can't stand Trump. Doesn't make me an enormous fan of Harris, to be honest. But at the same time, I think I'll put this one into gas guzzler. And on the election, I'm sure you guys don't want me to talk about the politics aspect of it, but I get the feeling there's going to be an impact on 400 scale models, and you may regret some of your voting choices. I was literally just speaking to a major distributor of models the other day, not necessarily 400 scale aircraft, but it doesn't really matter. They distribute a huge number of die-cast, and they told me that following the election, they are scrambling to import as much as they can in advance of any possible tariffs that are going to be stuck on imports from places like China. And when you say tariffs, all that means is costs passed on to the consumer. So if and when those tariffs appear, I can see price rises in the future. You reap what you sow, basically. You reap what you sow. So that is just, fortunately, I feel the way things are going to be heading. As I say, they are desperately scrambling to import more before those tariffs come into play. So I'll be interested to see how that election impacts the model industry. Trump's relations with China generally have been a bit frosty, and so that could also be a problem considering all of these models are made in the People's Republic. So we'll see, I guess. Batten down the hatches and let's see what awfulness 2025 brings on that. But back to the releases. It's I said every month it's a very Gemini set. You've got a lot of rubbish really, but there's also some really nice models here when you look at these regional releases, aircraft that are unique, molds which only Gemini and JC have access to and are good, and that is pleasing to see. So it's a pretty average set, but with some good highlights. Okay, cool, and that is it from me once again. So thanks very much for watching, guys, and I imagine that within a week or two there will be the NG video up as well, and from what I'm seeing, I can't say that they're going to be scoring especially well. Until next time, bye-bye.